Welcome to Oral Histology and Embryology class. So we're going to start with this chapter, chapter 3, which is on the development of the oral facial region. Oral means mouth, okay, so how the mouth gets developed. Facial refers to the face, how the face gets developed. And when a mother finds out that she's pregnant, what happens is the embryo starts to look like this, so the baby starts to look like this, and then over several weeks it starts to develop, the features start to develop, but initially it looks really like an alien, if you will. It does not look like a proper face, but it eventually develops, and that's what we're going to learn about. We're going to learn how and what exactly happens when to make the face develop. So let's just recap a little bit. When the sperm and the egg meet, it becomes a zygote. Okay, so there's like two cells over here. The cells just multiply and replicate. And when you have like a ball of cells, like that you see over here, so many cells, that's known as a morula. The morula then becomes a blastocyst. A blastocyst is like there's lots and lots of cells here, just dividing. The cells are dividing. It's kind of like an early stage of an embryo, and then an embryo happens, and this is the embryo, this is the baby that's inside the womb. So when you have this blast of cell, this blastocyst, this happens from 0 to 2 weeks, is known as the proliferative period. It then becomes an embryo. So this blastocyst, what we call it, becomes an embryo. Now before that, let's look at this cell. Let's look at this blastocyst. When we look at this blastocyst, there's 3 layers, what we call germ layers. And so the outer layer is known as the ectoderm. And what that means is this yellow ectoderm, it eventually becomes the baby's skin, the baby's hair, the baby's nervous system. Okay, so it looks nothing like the skin or the hair right now, but it will become that as the baby develops. The inner is the mesoderm. And that becomes the muscles, the baby's muscles, the baby's bones, the baby's heart. And then the inside part is the endoderm, okay? And that becomes the digestive system, the lungs, the thyroid. So the way to remember this is ectoderm and endoderm sound similar, right? But if you look at the C and the N, C alphabetically comes first in the alphabet, so it's in the outer, or C for circle is the outer circle, if you will. And N is all the way in the inner side, right? So inner I-N-N has 2 N's, right? I-N-N-E-R, N for the inner part, or N comes later in the alphabet, so it's more inside the cell. And then mesoderm is in the middle, M for middle, mesoderm for middle. Okay, and that makes the muscle, the bones, the heart, connective tissue, which we'll talk about. Okay, so when you get pregnant, or when someone gets pregnant, it becomes a zygote first. Remember, a zygote is just like not a lot of cells. Then it becomes a blastocyst. Blastocyst looks like this, a cluster of dividing cells. Then it becomes an embryo, 2 to 8 weeks it's an embryo, and then a fetus. So let's look at how the oral pharynx gets developed. So oral for mouth, pharynx for like the back of your throat, okay? The pharynx is like the back of your throat. So this is what the embryo looks like, okay? At 4 weeks, really, this is what the embryo looks like. So you're 4 weeks pregnant, the baby is inside you for 4 weeks. This is the brain. I know it looks nothing like the brain right now. And this right over here, this groove that you see, or this pit that you see, is known as an oral pit. It happens in the 4th week of development. Underneath that is the heart. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So this is going to become the brain, the baby's brain. This is going to become the baby's mouth. This will eventually become the baby's heart. The oral pit becomes kind of like a pocket. Okay, and so again, this is the brain, and early on it's called the forebrain. So the forebrain, it hasn't fully developed into the brain, so we call it the forebrain. And then this is the heart. Okay, so this is the heart. So that purple thing that we're looking at right here, that is the heart. The blue thing is the gut. The gut is like your digestive system, if you will. Now this area right here, which we said is the oral pit, this is also known as stomatium. So this area right here between the brain and the heart, known as an oral pit, also known as a stomatium. And the way to remember this is that the mouth, or the oral cavity area is the opening to the stomach, right? So that comes from this STOM comes from stomach, and the intestines or the duodenum comes from this side. This word. So the duodenum is basically like the first part of the small intestine and the stomach. So that's how you can remember it. The oral pit kind of opens up, the way to the stomach and small intestine or the duodenum. Okay, what else should we know? We should know that the oral pit is where the mouth is, and then this oral pit kind of develops into the maxillary process, which is maxillary stands for the upper jaw, and mandibular arch, which stands for the lower jaw. So the upper jaw and the lower jaw all comes from this, or stems from this oral pit, from the stomatum. Okay, so again, this is your brain, known as the forebrain, because it's not really a properly developed brain yet. This is your frontal nasal process. So front basically means like this is your frontal bone, your front part of your forehead, if you will, your forehead. And nasal, this will eventually become a nose. This is your oral pit, which is right underneath, and the oral pit is so fascinating because it develops into the maxillary process, so the upper jaw, and this is actually like the cheeks, and the lower jaw, which is known as your mandibular arch. So let's see what happens. This is your heart, right? The pericardial cavity is also known as your heart. Cardio being your cardial, right? Comes from like the heart. That when you think of cardio, I want you to think of heart. And so the heart starts beating as early as the 4th week. So at the end of the 4th week, the baby's heart starts beating. So if you go for an ultrasound at your 4-week scan, you could probably hear the heartbeat because that's when it starts beating. Now, this is something that we really need to understand. So again, this is your embryo, and when we're looking at the embryo, we're looking at it from the side. Okay, so this is like a side view of the embryo. And if you look really, really closely at the embryo, you're going to see these like grooves or these lines here, and those are called pharyngeal grooves or branchial grooves. When you look at these lines, they kind of look like the gill slits of fish. Okay, they kind of look like that. And this is known as, like this whole area right here, they have arcs, right? Like, so they have the 1 arc, 2 arc, 3 arc, 4 arcs, and 5 arc. These are known as the pharyngeal arches or the branchial arches. Now, when you look at the word pharyngeal, you might think of pharynx, and pharynx is really like the back of your mouth, right? So the back of your throat, the back of your nose, is all part of the back of your throat. It's all part of the pharynx, okay? So this is basically, these are arches, and what's cool about these arches is that each number, so there's like arch 1 or pharyngeal arch 1, pharyngeal arch 2, they all become something. It's really cool. So the baby is going to develop, features are going to develop from these arches. So we're going to look at that. Now let's look at this from a different view. Okay, so this is from the side view, right? If I were to turn the embryo like facing me, so looking at it from head on directly, it would look like this. So you would see like those, remember those arches that we were looking at? When you look at it from head on, like straight through, like this, if you were to turn the embryo and you're looking at it in front, and these are the arches: arch 1, arch 2, arch 3, arch 4, and arch 5. Okay, and you have one on the right and you have one on the left. Okay, so it's like a mirror image. We also have grooves. So remember how I said those lines that we're looking at? Those are grooves. Okay, they're also known as let's see, it says here vertical grooves, right? So they're basically branchial grooves, or some people call it pharyngeal grooves. Okay, so because these two words are the same. So let's look at these grooves. These indents on the outside, there's one over here, 1 groove, 2 groove, here's a 3rd groove, here's a 4th groove. So we have four grooves on the outside. On the inside, okay, we can see the arches, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We also have something called pharyngeal pouches. So here's 1 pouch here, here's another pouch, here's the 3rd pouch, here's the 4th, it's the 3rd pouch, here's the 4th pouch, and here's the 5th pouch. And again, from all of these arches and pouches and, grooves, things happen, things get developed. So more importantly, what we're going to look at is that when we look at these pouches, for example, so pouch 1, which is right here, it actually becomes something. It actually becomes, something like it says here, auditory tube. So it becomes a tube in the ear. If you look at pouch 2, it becomes something. It becomes a tonsil. If you look at pouch 3, it becomes something. And so there's memory tricks that I'm going to share with you so that you can remember how each number of whatever number pouch, so the second pouch becomes the tonsil, the third pouch becomes the inferior parathyroid, the fourth pouch becomes, there's each thing becomes something, the superior parathyroid, and the fifth pouch becomes the ultima branchial body. And so I'll tell you a trick to remember that later on. But what I want you to know for now is that each pouch becomes something, it forms something in the baby, which is in the head and neck region. So if we look, this is the embryo, okay, and again, they can see the pouches, right? And as the days progress, it develops more and more. So this is the side view. This is head-on view, so the frontal view, okay, and then you can actually see those arches right here, and these arches that we're looking at are very similar to these ones here. So arch 1, arch 2, arch 3, arch 4, and so on. So we're going to look at that in more detail. Let's look at this slide. Okay, we're going to look at the arches now. Okay, so the pharyngeal arches. So let's start with the first one, arch 1. The first arch is also known as your mandibular arch. Okay, so sometimes we'll say, let's go back here, this is the first arch. It's also known as your mandibular arch because it kind of makes the mandible, okay, the lower jaw. So the first arch, also known as a mandibular arch, what does it make? What comes from this first arch? What derives from this first arch? And the answer is muscles of mastication. So mastication means chewing. When we're chewing, there are muscles involved in chewing, and we'll look at that in another slide. But what you get from the first arch is that you get the muscles of mastication. You also get nerves and blood supply, but what I really want you to know is that the first arch makes the muscles, or what gets derived from it, the muscles of mastication, the muscles we use for chewing, and there's 4 of them, which we will look at later. The second arch, the second arch is also known as the hyoid arch. We have this bone that's like a horseshoe-shaped bone right here. It's a hyoid bone, and this is also known as the second arch. Okay, so first arch is known as the mandibular arch, second arch is known as the hyoid arch. What do we get from the second arch? From the second arch, we get the facial muscles. So you know how, like, when we're smiling, there's muscles that help us smile. When we're frowning, there's muscles that help us frown. So facial muscles come from the second arch. And the hyoid bone also gets developed or comes from the second arch. And then we have the third, the fourth, and the fifth arches, and they, what you'll see over here is they also make muscles, which we'll look at. But what I really want you to know for now is that the first arch makes the muscles of mastication, the muscles for chewing. The second arch, also known as the hyoid arch, makes the muscles for facial expression, or the facial muscles, and the hyoid bone. Let's look at it again. When we're looking at this, so this is the same picture, okay, it's like this. These are the arches. Again, this comes from the embryo, just so that we can put it together. This is what the embryo looks like. They have these arches right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you were to look at it head on, this is what it looks like on the right and left side. So if we're looking at it, here's another view. So this is like one side, either the right side or left side. We have the arches, we have the grooves. The grooves are also known as clefts. Okay, so the pharyngeal grooves, which are those indentation from the outside, are also known as clefts. So when we look at the first cleft or the first groove, what does it become? It becomes the external auditory canal. So there's like in our ear, we have this canal in the middle ear, and then it eventually becomes the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. So all this comes from the eardrum, or the external auditory canal. All like the stuff in the ear comes from the first cleft. The second, what you'll look at here is the second, the third, the second, third, fourth, and fifth, second, third, and fourth cleft, they actually kind of close together. And that's what the next slide is actually going to show you, that there's no other pharyngeal groove seen in the 5th week. So this is like the 5th week, basically, and what happens is all this cleft close together. Before, if you were to look at it before, let's see if I can find a better view, you could kind of see those clefts here, but then it kind of closes up. You can see that they kind of close up. So when they close up, so here you can see the grooves, the 4 grooves here, but then what happens after a while is they actually close up. So by the end of the 5th week, okay, so after the 5th week, they kind of close up and then there's no grooves here. The only one I want you to know is that the first cleft, okay, the first groove makes, it is to do with the ear, makes the external auditory canal or meatus. Okay, let's look at the pouches now. Oh, and I should also say, with the pouches, which is on the inside, the first pouch, what comes from the first pouch? The first pouch makes, again, something to do with the ear again. So it makes a tube in the ear and a tympanic cavity. These are just stuff in the ear. So the first pouch makes the ear stuff. The second pouch, let's go to here, the next slide. The second pouch makes the tonsils. The third pouch, which is right here, it makes the inferior parathyroids and thymus. And I'm going to tell you what these mean in a bit. The fourth one makes the superior parathyroid. So this pouch makes the superior parathyroid. And then the fifth one makes the ultima branchial body. All right, let's look at what all these means. And then we'll look at a memory trick on how you can remember this. So let's look at the second one. The second one makes the tonsils, right? So here, this is a picture of the tonsils right at the back of your throat. Okay, so tonsils are palatine tonsils. This is a palate right here. So it's a tonsil. Some of you guys, can see your tonsils when you open really wide. We're looking at tonsils. And tonsils are found at the back of your throat. And it's really important because it tries to protect you from getting sick. Like, it's got some great features that prevent you from getting sick. However, if it's inflamed, sometimes you do need to get them removed. But that's what the tonsils are, which come from the second pouch. The third pouch makes the inferior parathyroids and thymus. So let's look at what that means. So we have thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is located like right here in your neck region. It's actually right at the bottom or the base of the neck. And if you look really closely at the thyroid gland, we have like other glands inside it. You can see that it's in orange. The one on top is known as the superior parathyroid gland, because superior means it's above, and the bottom one is inferior. Inferior means below. Inferior parathyroid gland. Now, what do these glands do? Let's look at the thyroid gland first. The thyroid gland, even though it's so small, it's actually a very important gland. It's a hormone gland. It makes hormones, and it helps you with your metabolism. It helps you grow. It helps your body develop. So we need the thyroid gland. And then we have these parathyroid glands. The above one is the superior one. Inferior is the below one. And what they do is they kind of help you with maintaining the right amount of calcium in your blood. We need calcium, right? Calcium is good for bones, calcium is good for teeth, and so it helps with balancing the right amount of calcium. So if we have too much calcium or too little calcium, this gland will help regulate it. So the inferior parathyroid, gland, it comes from the second pouch. The superior, which is the one above, comes from the fourth pouch. From the second pouch, so the second pouch, we said the inferior parathyroid gland comes. Also, the thymus comes. Now, this is not a thymus, This is what a thymus looks like. What do you guys know about the thymus? Thymus is a small gland. It's found in the lymphatic system. So basically, I just want you to know thymus is a gland that makes T cells, T cells. And T cells are cells that are needed when you're sick. So if you're sick, if you're fighting an infection, T cells come out and try to kill the bacteria or try to make you feel better. So T cells come out when you're sick and they try to make you feel better. This, usually this thymus gland, it produces all of your T cells before birth, and then during puberty, it kind of just goes away. So we don't always have a thymus gland. Soon it becomes like a fatty tissue. So thymus is only there till puberty, really. And it's very active when you're inside the mother's womb, and even early on in your early ages, but it goes away in puberty. What do we need the thymus for? Thymus is good for fighting infection. It makes T cells, which help with fighting infection. So when you get sick, it helps. The fifth pouch, which is right here, is the ultimobranchial body. And really, it's just a gland found at the very bottom of your neck, and it makes this hormone. And the hormone is called calcitonin. I'm going to write this down because you probably need to know this for a test. So it makes a hormone, and this hormone is called calcitonin. And this, you can see it has the word calcium in it, because this hormone, what it does is it reduces the amount of calcium we have in our blood. So if we have too much calcium in our blood, it's not a good thing. And so calcitonin comes out, this ultimobranchial body, the small organ that's found in the neck area. It tells it sends a signal to tell the calcium to get reduced in the blood. So it slows down the calcium in the blood. Okay, how can we remember all this? There's so much information that we just got thrown out at us, right? So what are some tricks to remembering this? Let's start with this one. When we look at the first cleft, which is from the outside, number one, so first cleft makes something to do with the ear. Okay, so I'm just going to write down ear. Ear has the first, so I'm going to put A for number one. Okay, so ear has the letter A. Okay, A is your first letter in the alphabet. Okay, so the first cleft is to do with the ear. Okay, that's to do with cleft. Let's look at the first pouch. So again, the first pouch is to do with the ear because it makes like these structures which are part of the ear, like the eardrum, for example, the tube in the ear. Again, the ear has the letter A, which is the first letter in the alphabet, and it's the first arch. Okay, that's how you can remember this. What about the second one? The second pouch makes the palatine tonsil. Okay, let's see this. I'm going to write down tonsil, and I'm going to say this is the second pouch. So it's second for two, right? So two, and maybe two, they kind of, sound similar. It has the letter T for two. So the second pouch makes the tonsil. All right, what about the third pouch? How can we remember that the third pouch makes the inferior parathyroid and thymus gland? Okay, well, let's look at this. The third pouch, if I were to write down parathyroid, you can see that it has THYR actually. So just take the TH and take the R, and this kind of looks like third, right? Looks like three. So the parathyroid, the inferior parathyroid, and the thymus, which again, thymus has TH. TH is the beginning of the third pouch. That's how you can remember. The third pouch has the parathyroid. It should be the inferior parathyroid. And how can you remember inferior? Well, THI, third, right? So I and I for inferior, they kind of go together. So it makes the inferior parathyroid gland, and thymus has TH for third. So that's easy to remember, right? Okay, but what about the fourth pouch? The fourth pouch makes the superior parathyroid gland. How can you remember that? Okay, so here's what I want you to think about, and this might seem far-fetched, but let's just try to remember. So 4, right? The fourth pouch makes the superior parathyroid. So superior, I want you to think of Superman, and I want you to imagine Superman being very forceful or powerful, but I'm trying to get this word right here, forceful. He's really forceful. 4 and number 4. So the superior parathyroid gland is from the fourth pouch. So superior might sound like Superman. Superman is very forceful. 4 for number fourth pouch. And then the fifth pouch makes the ultimobranchial body. So Ultimo, we can think of like the ultimate Superman, maybe the ultimate Superman. He's number 5. He's the fifth one down. So the ultimate one is number 5. He comes right after Superman. So 4 is the superior parathyroid, and then the ultima branchial is number 5. Ultimate. Think of ultimate as number 5. So what we just looked at was we looked at what comes from the grooves or the clefts, and we looked at what comes from the pouches. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the vascular development. And the vascular, when we say vascular, what I'm looking at is blood vessel. And what you see in the blood vessel of the embryo is you'll see this is the first arc blood vessel, this is the second arc blood vessel, the third, the fourth, the fifth is somewhere in the middle, and the sixth. And what I want you to know is that the first and second is if you can see, it's starting to develop. It starts to develop in the 4th week, but then it disappears in the 5th week. So you can see here, there's no blood vessel because it disappears in the 5th week. But the third one is there, it's prominent, and then the third one, it kind of goes, the blood vessel. So it comes, like there's the heart that makes this aortic arc, and so it comes, there's a blood vessel that comes from the heart, and it's kind of feeding, like we need blood supply, right? We need it to stay alive. And what you can see is the third one is the prominent one, and that one goes to the face, okay? So it kind of takes the blood to supply to the face or the facial area. The 5th one, and let's see here. So with the first one disappears, the second one disappears, the third one is prominent, so is the 4th one. The 4th one is prominent, 5th one is not really there, disappears, and the 6th one is prominent. So the ones that are prominent are the 3rd vessel, the 4th vessel, and the 6th arch vessel. So they come from the arch. And the 3rd one, the 4th one, and the 6th one are the prominent ones, are the dominant ones, are the ones that stay. The other ones disappear. So let's look at the 3rd arc. Okay, so remember this, the first one disappeared, the second one disappeared, but the 3rd one is there, the 4th one is there, and the 6th one is there. And again, you have one on the right and you have one on your left. So when we look at the 3rd one, it actually supplies the common carotid artery. So remember, carotid means it's an artery that comes from the heart. Okay, so it's the aorta, which is the heart, and it's pumping blood, and so it goes to the common carotid artery, which is an artery basically that kind of splits into two. It splits into external and internal. Let's look at it better. So we have the common carotid artery. This is in an adult. Okay, so we have a common carotid artery. This is what it would look like when it's developed, when the baby's brain gets, when the baby's development is complete. This is what it would look like. Carotid artery. So this is the heart. The heart is like underneath here. The heart brings up this one artery. It's called the common carotid artery, which splits into two. It splits into the external carotid artery, external for the outside, and it goes in the facial area. It supplies the face. And then we also have one on the internal, which kind of goes right up to the brain. Okay, so the 3rd arc makes these arteries. The arteries derives from it. You get the common carotid artery, which splits into the external carotid artery, and there's also the internal carotid artery. It can kind of get split into two, like we see over here. Now, interestingly enough, what happens is at first, the internal carotid artery actually supplies the face, and the external carotid artery actually goes to the brain. But then, at the 7th week, it shifts. And so today, if you were to look inside, your head and neck area, your external carotid artery actually goes to the face, because that makes sense. External is for the face, and your internal stays inside your brain. So the blood supplies the brain. But before the 7-week period of the baby, it's actually the opposite. It switches. But now, after the 7 weeks, so when the baby is 7 weeks, 8 weeks, 9 weeks inside the womb, external supplies the face, internal supplies the brain, and that's how it stays throughout our life. Okay, remember how I said that the first arc, which is also known as your mandibular arc, the lower jaw arc, makes the muscles of mastication or become the muscle of mastication. These are the 4 muscles of mastication. In orofacial, we're actually going to learn about this in more detail. But for now, what I want you to know is recognize these names. So we have the temporalis muscle, we have the masseter, we have the pterygoid, we have lateral, and medial pterygoid. And again, we'll go over this in detail when we do orofacial, when we look at this in orofacial. For now, just recognize these names. These muscles get developed in the 5th week. So in the 5th week, we start to see these muscles come out. In the 7th week, so at the end of the 7th week, so let's say, a woman's pregnant and the baby, she's 7 weeks pregnant. So the baby or the embryo is 7 weeks. By the end of the 7th week, the nerves have developed. So this is the brain. And if you look at the brain from the inside, so what you're looking at is you pick the brain up and you turn it upside down and you're looking at this brain from the back or from the inside view of the back. There's nerves, and these nerves are really important because they send messages to different areas of your body. So we have like the olfactory, which is the nerve number 1, and olfactory helps you with the smelling, with smell. We have the optic, which is nerve number 2, which is for the eyes. And again, these are known as the cranial nerves, cranial for brain because it comes from the brain. And again, in orofacial, we're going to look at these different nerves. But let's see, what we need to know for this class is that by the end of 7th week, each arc, okay, so we have like different arc. Each arc makes a nerve, or there's a cranial nerve that gets derived from it. And that's what we're going to look at. So the first arc, okay, and again, when I say arc, what am I referring to? I'm referring to this. Okay, so the first arc, what cranial nerve, what nerve does it make? It makes the 5th nerve. Okay, so the 5th nerve, and the 5th nerve, this is it's in Roman numerals, is known as the trigeminal nerve. Sometimes people call it the mandibular nerve because it goes into the mandible, the lower jaw. Okay, so that enters into the lower jaw. So the 5th nerve, which is known as the trigeminal nerve, comes from the first arc. I know this is a lot. At the end, I'm actually going to skip to it just to show you. At the end, I have a chart that tells you what each arc, what they actually what comes from each arc, what comes from each cleft. So we're going to look at that later in more detail. But for now, what I want you to know is that the first arc makes the 5th nerve, where trigeminal nerve comes from there. This is the embryo again. We're looking at it from the front, and here you can see the arches. So you can see that the first arc has the trigeminal nerve. The second arc has the facial nerve, which is the 7th nerve. Third one, okay, makes the nerve that's associated with the third one is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the 9th cranial nerve. And then the last one, the 4th arc, has the vagus nerve, which is the 10th one. What do I want you to know here? I want you to know that when we're looking at the tongue, okay, so when we're looking at the tongue, there are 3 nerves that are associated with the tongue that give feeling to the tongue, that give sensation, that give taste to the tongue. So we have the 9th, okay, nerve, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it goes to the back of the tongue. And it helps you with the taste of the back posterior, which is the back of the tongue. We have the 7th cranial nerve, which is part of the facial nerve, and it sends the feeling of taste to the front of the tongue, so the anterior part of the tongue. And then we have the 5th cranial nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve, and that gives feeling, that gives senses. You have a sensation in the front part of the tongue, the anterior 2/3. So the tongue has 3 different nerves that's needed in order for it to work. Let's recap here. The first arc gives the trigeminal or mandibular nerve. The second arc gives the facial nerve. The third arc gives the glossopharyngeal, and the 4th arc gives the vagus nerve. All right, let's look at a trick to remembering remembering that the arches and the nerves, like what's a way to remember this? So let's go over the first one. The first arc is associated with or derives from, or the mandibular nerve basically derives from the first arch or the trigeminal nerve. Okay, how can we remember this? Well, mandibular nerve, also known as a trigeminal nerve, I want you to think of mono. Mono means number 1. Okay, so the first arc, okay, has the mandibular nerve derives from the first arch. The second arc is the facial nerve, and so let's just look at the number. Mandibular nerve is known as the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th nerve. This is in Roman numerals. The facial nerve is known as the 7th nerve. Okay, so this is the 7th nerve. Glossopharyngeal is the 9th nerve. So in Roman numerals, the 9th nerve is like this, and vagus is the 10th nerve. Okay, so second arc and facial nerve, they go together. So when I think of facial nerve, I want you to look at this one. When we teach in the classroom, we teach face to face. Okay, that's how we teach. Online, although it's a new norm, most teachers might prefer the face-to-face so that we can actually see our students' expressions. So with face-to-face, it has the number 2 in it, right? So 2 and facial nerve kind of goes together. So that's how you can remember that the second arc is with a facial nerve, which is the 7th one. The third arc is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, so how can we remember this? I want you to take a look at G. You know how sometimes we have a 3G network, when we're thinking about internet or something, like, on the phone or something, 3G network. So 3G, so glossopharyngeal is derived from the third arch. And the fourth arch is the vagus nerve. This one, if I look at the number 4, I should put it like this. I can see the letter V, like right here, an upside down V. And so the V for vagus, okay, which is the 10th nerve. So maybe these tricks might help you remember that the mandibular nerve or trigeminal nerve is derived from the first arc of the pharyngeal arch. The facial is from the 2nd, glossopharyngeal, G is from the 3rd, and vagus is from the 4th. Okay, now let's look at the cartilage. So there's cartilage is basically like firm, hard tissue, and then it becomes bone. And so each arc, as we see here, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, has or makes cartilage. There's cartilage that gets derived from this. It becomes something. So let's look at what it becomes. The first arc becomes something called, the first arc makes, or the Meckel's cartilage is found in the first arc. Okay, so the first arc makes the Meckel's cartilage. This basically, the Meckel's cartilage, eventually it, the body of the mandible, so the lower jaw kind of forms around it. Okay, so the Meckel's cartilage soon disappears, and then the lower jaw or the body of the mandible gets formed in the first arc. Another thing that also gets derived from the first arc is the 2 bones of the ear, the malleus and the incus bone. And that's what this is, the ear. We can see the malleus and the incus bone. The stapes, which is another bone of the ear, these are the tiniest bones that you can find in your body. It comes from the second arc, but the malleus and the incus comes from the first arc. Interestingly enough, the malleus and the incus, they actually kind of, you can see here, this is the first arc, the malleus, incus, and Meckel's cartilage all gets derived from the first arc. These are all cartilage, which is like firm tissue, not quite bone yet. And the mandible, so the lower jaw, is supported by the malleus and incus for the first 20 weeks of prenatal life. So when the baby is reaches the 20-week period, then the malleus and incus does not support the mandible. Then we have other joints that support the mandible, but for the first 20 weeks, the malleus and incus is supporting the mandible. All right, so again, the first arc makes the Meckel's cartilage. And again, to remember this, M, I want you to think M for mono. Mono means 1, which is the first arc. The second one, okay, the second arc makes the Reichert's cartilage. So the Reichert's cartilage comes from the second arc. Sorry, it's this one right here. And it's also, remember, the second arc is also known as the hyoid arc. What else comes from the second arc? We get the stapes, which is the third bone in the ear. We get the styloid process, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in a bit. So there's also the styloid process. Actually, I'll show you right now. This is the styloid process. So in the skull, we have the styloid. So stylo for like stylo pen or a stiletto heel, like a sharp thing that sticks out in the skull. That's the styloid process that gets derived from the second arc. We also have the hyoid bone. Okay, so the hyoid bone. So we have the lesser horn and the upper body of the hyoid. So what does that mean? If you look at the hyoid bone, okay, this is the hyoid bone, which is in the front of the neck. And the hyoid bone is actually like a horseshoe-shaped type of bone, and it's really important. It's an important bone because it helps with speaking, it helps with swallowing, it supports the tongue. Okay, so it's good for speaking and it's good for swallowing. We need the hyoid bone because it helps us with speaking and swallowing. So the hyoid bone, the lesser horn of the hyoid bone and the upper part of the body of the hyoid bone comes from the second arc. Okay, so the second arc, what does it derive? It derives the stapes bone, the styloid process, the lesser horn of the hyoid, which is the smaller horn that we see sticking out, and the upper body of the hyoid. So how can you remember that the second arc derives all of these things, like the stapes, the styloid process, and it also derives the Stylohyoid Ligament. It's a ligament, okay? I want you to look at this word. So stapes has the letter T, styloid has the letter T, Stylohyoid Ligament has the letter T, T for 2. So from the second arc, and also say Reichert's also has the letter T. So from arc 2, these are all the things that get derived from it. The stapes bone, which is part of the ear, the styloid process, okay, the Stylohyoid Ligament. It's a ligament that connects it from the styloid process to the hyoid, the horseshoe, right, hyoid bone, and also the lesser horn and upper body of the hyoid. Let's look at the face. So there's cartilage of the face. The cartilage, again, is like firm tissue that becomes into bone. And so initially what happens is before it actually becomes into bone, it's one whole cartilage of the face, and it's all kind of connected as we see here. It's like a single cartilage. It's like basically all connected, and then they eventually form into separate bones. And what it is when you look at it, if you were to divide it, even though it looks like one whole bone, if you were to divide it into sections, they actually make up different bones. So we're looking at nasal capsule. So the nasal means nose. So this is like the nose. Eventually it becomes a different bone, which is called the ethmoid bone. And I have a whole other video on the skull, which we'll look at again in orofacial as well. But this is the nasal bone. Then we have the sphenoid bone, which looks like the wing, like a bat kind of flying, or like a butterfly has wings on each side. That's the sphenoid bone. The auditory capsule, so auditory for ears, so that's the auditory capsule. And there's also something called the basi-occipital cartilage. And so base, the kind of bottom, occipital, the very back of your skull or your head is the occipital bone. And so the very base of it is kind of right here. So this is like the basi-occipital cartilage. So all of those are basically like one cartilage, one firm tissue that eventually separates into different bones, individual bones. And so the cartilage, the firm tissue, if you look at it, you can actually draw a line like this, and this is like on top of the skull. And what this is trying to show here is that this is the cranial base. Cranial means brain. So there is a brain that's sitting on top of this base, and you can draw a line right here, and that's what it's saying here, that the cranial base is determined by drawing the line here from the nasal bone. So the nasal bone is where the nose is. This is where your nose is, and then you draw it to the sella. The sella turcica is what we actually say. It is part of the sphenoid bone, which again we'll look at later when we learn about the skull, and then the basion. The basion is like, if you look at the back of the skull, there's this is part over here, so that's what it's called. So if you were to basically draw a line over here, the brain would be right on top of this. So this line is like the cranial base, the base of where the brain is. The brain is right on top over here. So when we're looking at bones of the face, in an embryo, bones eventually do start to develop. And so what bones are developed? Well, we have the frontal bone, and again, we'll go over this in more detail when we learn about the skull. So it's the frontal, and that makes sense, right? It's the front of the forehead. F for forehead is where your forehead is. Parietal is the side. The squamous portion of the temporal. Squamous means the top, okay, like the top part. This is what it's referring to. This is the temporal bone. The squamous portion of the temporal bone is there, and the interoccipital bone. So the occipital bone is at the very back, and we're kind of all joins together. Right here is the interoccipital bones. So all of these are bones that are being formed in the embryo. So what we just looked at were bones that kind of cover the brain for the most part, and then there's also bones that cover the face as well. And the facial bones that get covered, they are listed as we see here. So I'll just outline where they are, and it's kind of color coded. So there's pre-maxillary, so that's like right over here, number 2. There's the maxillary bone, which is right here. There's the zygomatic, which is also known as your cheekbone, which is over here. And there's the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So this is your temporal bone right here. This is the squamous part of the temporal bone, and then right here is the petral part. Okay, so like the back part, posterior part, if you will. The petrous part of the temporal bone. The temporal bone would be over here. This part over here is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So these bones, they look like this, and then eventually they kind of get bigger and they spread, and it kind of takes over the face, and it develops nicely. The maxillary bone, so the maxillary, when we think of maxillary, I want you to think of the upper jaw. Mandibular is for lower jaw, maxillary is for the upper jaw. What happens with the maxillary bone is that it grows medially. So medially kind of means it grows to the center. All right, let's draw this out. So here's the okay, so let's just look at this. This is the eye, this is the nose, and we're looking at it head on. Okay, so the eyes aren't properly in its proper position yet because it's still a growing embryo. Here is the maxilla. Okay, and what happens is the maxilla kind of grows medially, which means it kind of grows towards the middle, and it kind of takes over like this, and it fuses together. And the palate, so the roof of your mouth is your palate, that also it kind of all fuses together. So the upper jaw and the palate kind of gets fused together like this. And then the mandible, so at the bottom, remember the Meckel's cartilage, which is part of the mandible, that also grows into each other and replaces the Meckel's cartilage. And then the Meckel's cartilage kind of disappears, and you get like a mandible. So this slide again just tells you that the maxillary bone, they kind of grow medially into the palate, which means it goes to the middle, kind of goes to where the palate is, and it just fuses all together. The mandible also gets fused together as the embryo grows. We also have sutures of the face. So when we're looking at sutures, suture is basically where the two bones, when they meet together. So when the two bones, we have a bone here and we have another bone here, when they meet, this over here is a suture. Okay, so when the bone meets, it's a suture. The joining of bones is suture. I cannot write today. Okay, so when we're looking at sutures, what happens is there are 3 sutures that I want you to know that is on our base, on an embryo. There is the ZT, the FM, and ZM. And the way this works is the first stands for zygo, or comes from the zygomatic bone. So the cheekbone is your zygomatic bone, and T is your temporal bone, which is right here. So this is your zygomatic bone, this is your temporal bone. So where they meet is right over here, which is known as the zygomaticotemporal suture. Okay, where the zygoma, which is a cheekbone, and the temporal, which is like your temple kind of bone, when they fuse together, it makes a suture, and that is the zygomaticotemporal bone. Then we have the FM. The FM is the frontal, so this is your frontal bone, okay, where the forehead is, and when it joins the maxillary bone, okay, so where the upper jaw is, the maxillary bone, it joins right over here, which is known as the frontal maxillary suture. And the last one that I want you to know is this one is called the zygomaticomaxillary suture. So zygomatic bone is the cheekbone, and maxilla, this is your upper jaw, maxillary bone, and when they join and fuse together, it makes this zygomaticomaxillary suture. So the words are coming from the name of the bones, and again, we're going to go over the bones and the skull at a later time, but this, just for now, just recognize these three different sutures and the bones, or the names, the name of the bones and where it comes from. Because we're still talking about sutures, there's this word that I want you guys to know. It's called syndesmosis. Syndesmosis is basically articulation, sort of joining. And so when the bones join, so here's one bone, here's another bone. When it joins together, there is this band of connective tissue. Okay, so here's one bone, here's another bone, and it's, kind of joining, right? It's making like a suture over here. And this, where the suture is happening, this is where the connective tissue is. And I'll tell you what connective tissue is in a bit. But this joining on this band of connective tissue that we're looking at, this band of connective tissue is known as the syndesmosis. Okay, it's connective tissue. Just so we can recap here, when we're looking at connective tissue, what does that mean? When someone says connective tissue, what is that? There's different types of tissues we have in our body. The skin is your outer tissue. It's known as epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is like your skin. In our mouth, the gums are the outside layer of our tissue. So that's also an epithelial tissue. Then we have like the inside of our body is the connective tissue. So that's like where all the cells are. That's where like ligaments are. That's where the blood supply is. The blood is also here. So connective tissue is the inner tissue. So epithelial tissue is on the outside. Then we have the connective tissue. And then we have the bones. So the bones are, so basically three main levels: the epithelial tissue, the outer skin, connective tissue where the blood supply and cells are, and then the bones. So those are your three levels. So connective tissue is basically the inside part of your body. Three types of sutures: just simple, serrated, and squamosal. Simple is when it just fuses together, so the bone fuses together and makes a simple line. Serrated is when you have like a line that kind of looks like that, kind of zigzaggy, okay? And then squamosal is you have like overlapping kind of lines, so it's kind of like overlapping sutures, okay? So simple, serrated, and squamosal, different types of sutures we see on the face of an embryo. There's this other word that I want you guys to know, and this word is called synchondrosis. Synchondrosis is when we're looking at the cartilage. So we have bone, and cartilage in between. When we have cartilage in between, it's synchondrosis. But when we have connective tissue in between sutures, it's syndesmosis. Okay, so it's a little different. Connective tissue has N, syndesmosis also has N. Well, actually, so does this one. That doesn't help. Let's just try that again. When we look at syndesmosis, I'm trying to think of a way that you can remember syndesmosis versus synchondrosis. Synchondrosis has an R for cartilage, whereas, so this is where cartilage is formed in between the bone. And when we look at this one right here, syndesmosis, it has an M, and if you look at the connective tissue, there's two N's, right? And if you join them, maybe you can make an M. So M for syndesmosis, which comes from the connective tissue. Okay, so it's where the bone, connective tissue, bone, and This one, synchondrosis, is bone, cartilage, bone. So C and R for cartilage. Where does this happen? Where do we see this synchondrosis? Where do we see the bone and cartilage in the middle? We see this where the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone join, and where the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone join. So the ethmoid bone is this, the red one right here. When it merges with that sphenoid bone, which is in purple or pink, that is that suture that happens, or there's basically a cartilage that happens between the bone. And same thing with the sphenoid bone, which is this one, and the occipital bone. So you can't really see it here, but from the back view, you might be able to see the sphenoid bone and the occipital bone. They kind of merge together, and when they merge, it's actually a cartilage that's in between the bone, which is known as synchondrosis. So to recap, this is a table that outlines the different clefts or the different grooves and what gets formed from those clefts. So from these grooves or clefts, we get, with number one, the external auditory meatus or tube, or canal rather. So this, the ear comes from the groove or cleft 1, and from the pouch, which is from the inside, again, something to do with the ear. So remember, ear has the letter A in it, A for 1. When we look at the second, third, and fourth cleft, it actually kind of fuses together, so we're not concerned with there's nothing that we need to know from these grooves or clefts. But from the pouches, we do need to know stuff. So from the pouches, from second pouch, we have the tonsils. Third pouch, we have the thymus and the inferior parathyroid gland. Fourth pouch, we have the superior parathyroid gland. And in the fifth pouch, some people combine the fourth to sixth together. Some people separate it. But for the fifth pouch, we have the Ultima branchial body. And go back to the video to look at the memory tricks. When we're looking at the arc, the aortic arch, don't worry too much about this, but I just want you to know is that the third arc makes the carotid artery, so the common carotid artery, and it gets merged, it gets separated into external and internal. And then I want you to know that the fourth one is also important, and the sixth one. The fourth arch goes into the aorta, so it goes straight into the heart. And the sixth one, so if there was the sixth one over here, that one is for the lungs, okay? The sixth one, it supplies the lungs. So there's like a pulmonary artery that goes to the lungs. So the sixth one goes to the lungs, fourth one is the aorta, and third one is the carotid artery. So it's like basically an artery that goes straight up to the head and neck area, because it's a common carotid artery. There's an artery that comes from the heart up into the head and neck region. So just remember, third, fourth is for the aorta, and sixth is the pulmonary artery, which goes to the lungs. So aorta is for heart, carotid artery goes straight to from the heart, it goes straight up to the head and neck. The cranial nerves, so each arc has different cranial nerves. So the first one is the trigeminal one, or the mandibular nerve, right? So mandibular nerve comes from the first arc, or trigeminal. Facial for the second one, with face-to-face learning, phase 2, number 2 phase. Number 3 is glosso, so glosso 3G, think of 3G network. And then vagus is from 4, so if you were to draw the number 4, there is like a V on it, and that V for vagus. With regards to muscles, the muscles get derived from specific arc numbers. So the first arc makes muscles of mastication. These are the muscles for chewing. So remember, M for mono. Mono means 1. Muscles of facial expression. So again, face to face, right? So the second arc, facial expression, face to face. The third and fourth, they make other types of muscles like the Stylohyoid. The fourth one makes things to do with the larynx. The larynx is like where your voice box is. Okay, but these are the 2 important ones that I want you guys to know. And then we have the skeletal stuff that also gets derived from different arches. So arc 1, we have the malleus and the incus, which is the ear bone. We have the Meckel's cartilage, so M for mono, M for 1, and we have a sphenomandibular ligament that comes from arc 1. arc 2, we have the stapes, we have the styloid process, stylohyoid ligament, and remember it has T in them, so T for 2. 3, okay, so arc 3 makes hyoid, parts of the hyoid cartilage. So there's like the hyoid actually comes from the second arc, but parts of the hyoid actually cartilage also come from the third. And then we have the fourth one, which is the laryngeal cartilage, which again, this is to do with the voice box. So laryngeal is for the fourth. Okay, so if you see the word larynx anywhere, associate it with the fourth arc. And here's another table that also outlines the similar thing. So one of the things we did not talk about in the previous one was the Raychard's cartilage. So Raychard has TT for 2. So this arc develops the Raychard's cartilage as well as the stapes, styloid process, stylohyoid, all which has the letter T in it, T for 2. Third one is the hyoid, like the greater horns and the lower body of the hyoid. The upper body and the lesser horn is from the second hyoid. Third one is the rest of it. So the greater horn in the hyoid bone and the lower body of the hyoid bone. All right, that's it.